Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the newest album from Lower Dens, titled Escape from Evil. So there are some indie acts that fly so much under the radar that nobody beyond the hardcore fan base and some critics seems to know or care about it. I've barely gotten requests to cover these guys, buzz has been negligible, and even despite the fact that this new record has been very well received, nobody besides critics seems to really care about it. And this is something that I've noticed about certain acts getting a lot of critical acclaim. It rarely means much at all for the actual act outside of very specific circumstances. It needs to be spread wide enough to actually drive some buzz behind it. But even with that, it might not be enough. I can think of a slew of indie acts that because they didn't have that big performance or that huge hit single, they might have the love of critics, but nobody else. Even in the age of the internet, where fan bases can be everywhere, where certain sites like Pitchfork want to define the narrative of what's popular and hip, and where we have music critics who have accumulated nearly enough subscribers to reach nearly 500,000 people, it's often not enough to make some of these guys really break in the mainstream. So with all this in mind, let's talk a little bit about Lower Dens and whether they would even have a hope of getting in the mainstream. Beginning with the shoestring budget in Baltimore in 2010, their debut album immediately reminded me a lot of the War on Drugs in terms of the spacious, hazy, shoegaze-inspired mix and the willowy vocals of Jana Hunter. But that's where the similarities ended. For one, the bass and the guitar tones were far more reminiscent of post-punk, and the melodic grooves were simply phenomenally well balanced against the crisp, stripped-back percussion. They added more electronic elements with New Tropics in 2012, which eased back some of the haze and added some sharper, more defined grooves and some synthesizers. And while I definitely think it's a damn great album, I think I like their debut album just a little bit more, even though songs like Brains, Lamb, and especially Candy were huge standouts for me. Really dug those songs. And when I heard they were heading towards an even more pop-friendly direction, well, I'll be honest, I was a little bit mixed on that. I had no doubt in my mind that Lower Dens could write some stellar hooks if they were really pressed to do it, but I didn't want to see them shoved towards synth-pop like so many other bands in the indie scene have been in the past couple years and lose some of their unique identity. So what did we get from Escape from Evil? Honestly, it's a bit of a tricky album to judge, and one of the reasons I've been so slow and behind to talk about it is because it's not exactly an easy record to untangle. Now don't get me wrong, I definitely think it's a strong slice of work, and I think it's easily on par with their other albums, but it's also an album that tries to do too much lyrically and struggles to feel cohesive all the way through. In other words, it's a damn good record that does feature some huge highlights and some of the best songs of the year thus far, but might work a little bit better in chunks than as a whole. In other words, it might be a great record, but not one of the best of the year. So let's start with the simplest part of this conversation, the instrumentation and the production. Now, as I had expected, Lower Dens went towards synth pop with Escape from Evil, but they went towards probably the best possible era of it, the weirder side of the early 80s new wave scene, in the vein of Ultravox, or especially A Flock of Seagulls. In other words, while there are some gleaming keyboard lines anchoring the melodies, the prominent bass lines and the reverb-touched guitars, they have not gone away, although the majority of a lot of the distortion has been cleaned up. All this serves to give the album a much chillier feel to it, and I have to admit, I do miss some of the shoegaze distortion, that's just me, but they're also so much tighter, more melodic presentation against an expansive mix that does show a taste for pop friendliness. The echoing waves of guitar against that groove of Sucker Shangri-La, the slippery bass and great melodic interplay of Ordain, the echoing calm response of Q Vidis as the layers of guitar and bass just bleed across each other incredibly well, the drifting waves of wobbling synth and fluttering guitars against the muffled kick drums of Your Heart's Still Beating, the more bass-heavy simmer of Electric Current with that great thunderclap midway through the song, or that rigid bass and rubbery guitar lick of Non Grata, or the shining waves of synth over an incredibly solid bass line of Société and Anonyme. And then there are moments that are just flat out awesome, like the ominous rollicking low riff of Company that finally brings us some welcome sizzle thanks to that organ and emphasizes that unearthly feel even further. Fantastic song. And then there's To Die in LA, the lead-off single, which might as well be the red eyes of this year by the War on Drugs, one of the most powerful choruses you will hear on record this year. It's incredible. Now, I do have some nitpicks. The thinner guitar and synth tones do occasionally mean that some of the melodies can feel a shade off key at a couple points. The solos, they can meander a little bit, and I do wish the backing synth tones had a little bit more shimmering presence and power, but as it is, it lends this record this real alien, distant tone that recalls much of the music of the early 80s in the new wave scene, even drawing back into the eerie post-punk that inspired most of it that I really love. And one of the things that really helps this feel, makes me think that most of this was intentional, were the vocals of Jana Hunter. I'll admit, her voice can be a little bit tough to get used to, as it seems to often straddle an odd spot between masculine and feminine, especially when the reverb effects it is even turned up to add even more haze. And that does hurt the overall immediacy and approach of the record. It doesn't quite have that same pop friendliness. There's an odd feel of detachment that I get from Hunter's delivery that might fit some of the more complicated framing of these songs. I'll get to that in a second, but it does make it a little bit harder to initially connect, even though her yearning is at its most pure. She does have a lot of vocal presence, don't get me wrong, but throughout this album, it could could have afforded to land more potent emotive moments than she really does. It does feel a little bit muted there, at least for me. And this inevitably ties back into lyrics and themes, both of which Hunter actually described at length during interviews, which to some extent does irk me a little bit, and always has, because if you feel the need to explain abstraction like these lyrics, they haven't done their job to truly drive home their point. I use sites like Rap Genius as a reference more than a walkthrough anyways. The odd thing is that she probably didn't need the full explanations for these tracks, as many of the songs are often simple enough to decipher in their theory, often focusing on whirlwind passions that she knows are aiming to be destined to fail, attempting to provide comfort from her own place of isolation, her own detachment, or simply finding some degree of solace in being that outsider. And I'll give her credit, the distance that she holds these emotions allows her a lot of flexibility in the framing to write complicated situations. The Die in LA, Cool Vidis, and Electric Current, they are prime examples of this. Head Over Heels love or hookup songs, or just flat out sex songs that know said situations are destined to fail or be fleeting, but it's not going to stop that fantastic moment, and they are great for encapsulating that. And I definitely appreciate her final two songs about breaking away from a world of lies and failed connections, and her obvious fear of the cool dismissal of the normal around her, just rejecting her as that outsider, even as she does revel in it. But where this album frustrates me is in the songs about building those connections where Jaina Hunter tries to extend some form of comfort to another. Because while she has framed herself in order to make that disconnect, it makes her songs of solace feel a little bit oddly self-involved. Sucker's Shangri-La. It's intended as a track where she tries to speak with somebody who's struggling with addiction, but then she later tries to co-opt that person's voice in order to try to capture the drama from within, which is well framed, but it just doesn't work the way she wants it to. Ondine, similar case. Consoling somebody in a terrible relationship, saying that they should get together as soon as there is a window, they should be together, she could provide them more degree of comfort. I don't know, these sort of tracks, they tend to rub me the wrong way, especially as the instrumental tone could very easily be interpreted as seductive, and it becomes a track encouraging cheating with our narrator, which just, I don't like that. Your Heart's Still Beating, it's a little bit better, as Hunter tries to console somebody who's going through a family death, and her consolation, I'm sorry, just rings a little bit hollow here, a little bit distant. Now, to be fair, I get the feeling that she knows all this, it's intentional. Hell, if we're looking for a theme of this record, it'd be the complicated dynamic that comes with emotional isolation, with the most vibrant moments coming in the incredibly fragile human connections and how powerful they can be. But nearly all of it is framed from our narrator's isolated perspective, and lyrically I feel there isn't quite enough to really capture that frustration and pain that comes with not having those moments of connection. The most egregious example of this comes in I Am a Planet. And yeah, I get the essential metaphor of an individual separation, but there is an element of navel-gazing in the song that doesn't really feel earned, even though if it might be her coping mechanism of letting go of guilt. I'm sorry, it doesn't really work for me. It's the worst song on the album. Look, as a whole, I really do like this record. The instrumentation is memorable, distinctive without feeling like a throwback, and a natural evolution of Lower Den's sound, even though I do wish there was a little bit more distortion that managed to creep into it. I'm not gonna lie, the framing of these songs is excellent, even if the songs do feel a little bit underwritten at points to support the pile of themes that Hunter wants to explore with any sort of depth. But I'm not gonna deny this album, it really did click with me, and its best moments are absolutely stellar. So for me, it's getting a light 8 out of 10, and definitely a recommendation, especially if you're a sucker for new wave, and especially for the early 80s on the weirder post-punk side. I'm not quite sure it's a classic, and I'm still not quite sure how I rank Lower Den's 3 albums, but in a year where synthpop has come back in force, Lower Den's definitely has one of the strongest editions, so definitely make sure to check this out. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. If there's anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, or any other albums coming out that you want me to take a look at, more than happy to give them a listen. Until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.